1 in 2 veterans consider themselves political independents. If you're in a closed primary state like Pennsylvania, you come home, thanks for your service, but then you're told that you can't vote.
If you've joined the military, you've seen the world bigger than the state that you came from, and you got to go back to it and be small again. And it's hard when you're trained as an independent, and you're trained as somebody who wants to think about this, who also likes to compete, to come back to a place where you can't do that anymore.
We've kind of seen firsthand how important it is to be able to have access to be able to be involved in your local, state, and federal politics.
Veterans want a role to play. They understand, if you're a patriot in this moment, you understand that we are in a political crisis. It's a political crisis. It's not an American people crisis. It's a political crisis.
When more voters can vote, it's good for our democracy. And it's the only fair way to treat those of us who served our country to defend that democracy.
The idea that, guys and gals that I served with could go overseas and lose a leg and come home and can't vote in a primary is absurd. It's ridiculous, it's un-American, and I think we're in a unique position to be the forward edge.
Primaries were not created by the parties. Primaries were created by a populist progressive movement in the country, precisely because the parties and the special interests were locking out the American people from participating fully. I'm John Opdycke. I'm the president of Open Primaries. We're hosting this discussion today with Ballot PA, which is a very dynamic campaign to repeal closed primaries in Pennsylvania. It's a coalition of business, civic, and grassroots organizations working together to make that happen. Our co-host today is David Thornburg, who is the chairman of that effort. And before I turn it over to David, who's going to moderate today's discussion, just want to share a very brief story going back to 2016 when Open Primaries was running a campaign for top 2 open primaries in South Dakota. It was a great campaign, very grassroots, lots of involvement. And one of the things that we did was we put together a team of students from South Dakota and from Nebraska who went door to door. In fact, they got a mobile RV van and drove to some of the tiny little towns in northern South Dakota to talk to voters at their doors and in front of supermarkets. And one of the young men who was part of this team of students had just completed 4 years in the airborne. His name was Justin Opdycke. He had just gotten back from Afghanistan. And I remember asking him at one of our briefings, so what motivated you to work on open primaries after spending 4 years in the military? And he said, well, I just got back from a war zone and I find myself in another war zone, a political war zone, and I can't vote because I'm an independent. And that's really disturbing. And I'm fighting for democracy overseas, and I come back and I'm disenfranchised, and I want to change that. And fast forward 6 years, and veterans like Justin are active in the democracy issue all over the country, in Pennsylvania, in many other states. New organizations have formed. This is a really exciting and important development, and something we're going to talk about today. So let me turn it over to my co-host, David Thornburg. David, as I mentioned, is the chairman of the Ballot PA effort. He's the former executive director of the Committee of 70. He's been a business, educational, and civic leader in Pennsylvania for more than 30 years. And here's the most important thing about David. David does not coast. He is always, I don't know where he gets this from, but he is always looking for the next hill to climb, the next challenge to take on. And right now, that challenge is empowering the 1 million independent voters in Pennsylvania who are systematically disenfranchised from participating. And David, you picked a hell of a hill to climb this late in your career. So it's with great honor and respect, I turn it over to David Thornburg. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate that, except that comment about this late in my career.
Okay.
I got plenty of miles still left on the tires, John.
I know you do.
Well, it is terrific to be able to work with John and his team. I'm a avid watcher of many of the Open Primaries webinars, and I think this focus on veterans and the role they have to play in this critical debate is just hugely important, and it's terrific for us that we can put a spotlight on Pennsylvania, because this is one tough state. This is not going to come easy. As I say to folks, generally speaking, anytime you try to change the rules by which an elected official is elected, that makes them pretty nervous. And some of you I know Pennsylvania pretty well, and we play politics hard in this Commonwealth. But we are. It's been about a year since we launched this campaign, and we're clicking off the milestones. That's all I tell people. The journey may be long, but we're putting one foot in front of the other, and we're gaining significant ground. So let me just talk a little bit about the program, introduce some folks, and then I want to introduce an extra special guest. When we launched this campaign, we did some polling. We took a look at some of the research, and early on, what popped out at us, which just sort of blew folks away, is how many veterans consider themselves political independents. 1 in 2. 1 in 2 veterans consider themselves political independents. And as John said, if you're in a closed primary state like Pennsylvania, you come home, thanks for your service, but then you're told that you can't vote in half of the elections. And we went to look at the numbers in Pennsylvania, and it turns out there's about 800,000 veterans in Pennsylvania. So you do the easy math, and half of those might be ballpark 400,000 veterans shut out of primary elections in Pennsylvania. And some folks have challenged that number, and they say, well, that sounds kind of high. Maybe it's more like 200,000 or 175,000. And I said, look, to my mind, this game is not won until the number of veterans kept out of elections is zero. So that's what we're after. Anything more than that is just plain unacceptable. So that's what we have to work with, and that data point and all the men and women that represents is really what's been a great motivator for us. So here's what we're going to do tonight. We've got 3 different short conversations with veterans from Pennsylvania and around the country who've got different perspectives on why it's so critical that the veterans join this chorus. And let me introduce each of them in turn. First is Todd Connor, who was a lieutenant in the United States Navy, a businessman, entrepreneur, founder of something called Bunker Labs, which supports veteran entrepreneurs. And Todd is also the founder of Veterans for Political Innovation, and he's going to be talking with us in a minute about that. So welcome, Todd. Second in order of appearance is we bought one and get one free. Dan Kunze and his wife, Karen. Dan was an Army officer. He is a businessman, also has a law degree, and spent some time in the trenches in the Harrisburg State House in the Capitol. Karen is a pediatric nurse who also teaches at our terrific School of Nursing here at the University of Pennsylvania. And we're particularly pleased that we have both of them, because I think you have, as I recall, a 4-month-old, maybe, ballpark. So 3, he may be making an appearance. That's all I can say. I won't promise. And then finally, Paul Rykoff was also an Army officer. He was the founder and for 14 years the CEO of the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and he made that into a very powerful political and social force in this country. He stepped down and is now, excuse me, the CEO of Righteous Media, which does media and communications consulting. He also is the host of a terrific podcast called Independent Americans. So that's the lineup. But before we get to our conversations, as I said, I wanted to introduce an extra special guest, someone who played a huge role in my childhood, having been born and raised a Steeler fan in the city of Pittsburgh, and someone who we're really fortunate that we will be able to share with you, and that we've been able to bring to this cause. I'm not going to tell Rocky Blyer's story because Rocky can tell his story better than I can. But if we can cue the video, we'll hear Rocky talk about this issue.
Hi, I'm Rocky Blyer. If you are old enough, you may remember me for the years I played with the Pittsburgh Steelers. You may know I'm also a veteran. I served in the United States Army during the Vietnam War, where I was seriously wounded, earning the Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. The Steelers provided me the opportunity to battle back from my wounds and rejoin the team, ultimately to be an integral part of their 4 Super Bowl wins. My military service also provided me the opportunity to find a platform for the rights and freedoms of the American people, the ability to speak out on both state and national issues that become important to the American people. When I served our country in Vietnam, many of the men I served with couldn't vote or legally buy beer. They hadn't yet turned 21, but they could sacrifice their lives for this country. To a lot of us, it didn't seem fair that young men drafted to fight a war for their country couldn't pick the leaders who were sending them to risk their lives in battle. The rest of the nation shared that sentiment and came to believe that if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to vote. And in 1971, the 26th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified to lower the voting age to 18. It was ratified in 4 months, the fastest amendment in U.S. history. That's why I'm concerned by the fact that Pennsylvania denies independent voters the right to vote in primary elections. It's an archaic law. You see, half of all veterans identify as political independents. That veterans choose to register as independents doesn't surprise me. When you fight for our country and our freedom, you're not fighting for Republicans or Democrats. You're not on the red team or the blue team. You're on the red, white, and blue team. That's why it's particularly disappointing to know that independent voters are barred from primary elections in Pennsylvania. How would you explain to a young man or woman returning to their family in Pennsylvania from their service in Iraq or Afghanistan that they can't cast a vote in a primary election? That's un-American. Now it's time we do something similar in Pennsylvania. It's time to repeal closed primaries and allow all veterans and all voters who chose to register as independents to cast a vote in primary elections. Every voter should be able to vote in every election. When more voters can vote, it's good for our democracy. And it's the only fair way to treat those of us who served our country to defend that democracy. Since I retired from football, I've lived and worked and raised my family here in Pittsburgh, and I am proud to call myself a Pennsylvanian. I care a lot about the future of our Commonwealth. Pennsylvania has been very good to me, and as a veteran and a Pennsylvanian, I'm here to voice my full support for Senate Bill 690 in the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Join me. Visit ballotpa.org to sign the petition to let your state legislators know it's time to repeal closed primaries. Thank you.
Well, as I said, he can say it a lot better than I could, and that many of us could. But just the sense is it's un-American. It's just plain un-American to ask people to put their lives in the line of fire, and then when they come home, tell them they can't vote for their own commander-in-chief. So we're really appreciative, Rocky. I have to tell you, we recruited Rocky. We gave him a script, and he basically tore up the script and wrote it himself. So a lot of those are his words, and very very powerful words. And his story is inspiring. As I said, born and raised a Steeler fan. He kind of soft pedals it, but he had half of his foot basically blown off by a hand grenade. He's recovering from his wounds, and they said, "Well, son, you're never going to play football again." And he said, "Oh, yes, I am." and rejoins the Steelers, 4 Super Bowl rings, and a living legend and a great American. So with that as a backdrop, wanted to go to the conversations that we promised, and we'll start with Todd Connor. And Todd, I'm just want to begin with the question of what inspired you to start Veterans for Political Innovation, and why you think the voice of veterans is so important to these debates about democracy.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you. And as a Bears fan, I have to say I fully agree with Rocky's sentiments. And so that's a powerful video. John, thanks for hosting us. And also thanks to Paul, Dan, and Karen for being in this conversation as well. I don't want to put words in Paul and Dan's mouths, but I'll say that in some ways, this is like a third career for all of us. If you consider being in the military a first career, doing things, in and around politics is a second career. And this third career, this turn towards reform, is really about, I think, having done a lot of things, as I know Dan and Paul have as well, as Karen, sort of in the system, if you will, in the context of the frame of the debate. And you do that for long enough, and you get to the point where you say, this even the best outcomes in this environment as designed don't get us what we deserve as Americans. And so I think for me, it's been a little bit of a mental journey watching the events of this country. 2016 is a pivotal moment, but let's even go beyond that, past that, since that, to say, if you've been watching and engaged as an American for the last 20 years, you've just seen this decline in our politics, this sense that the worst behavior somehow gets rewarded. And then you contrast that to the work I've been doing for the last 10 years with military veterans and military spouses who are starting businesses, who represent the very best of America, of different political ideologies, people that are paying attention politically, who themselves might be interested in running for office, but look at the design of this system and say, I'd have to become something I'm not, or the worst version of myself, in order to compete and win in this environment. And so for me, it's been a little bit of a journey towards a series of aha moments in the last couple of years to say, what is the actual answer that moves America past this moment? And I'll tell you, for me, it involved reading a lot of books, listening to a lot of experts, and beginning to observe that bad behavior gets rewarded in the system as it's currently designed. And if you want to get beyond that, you really have to look at the incentive structure that exists. And fundamental to that is about, how do we get more people to participate, and how do we get more people to be able to express their opinions at the ballot box for the things that they want in their elected officials. And one book in particular I'll plug, which is The Politics Industry, written by Michael Porter and Catherine Gale, that really crystallized a lot of my own thinking. And the argument there is really for a final five system, which is the combination of open primaries and ranked choice voting, is similar to what we saw delivered in Alaska. And really, it's about incentive design. That if you can get to a system in which voters can show up, apart from including the political parties, but also independents, identify the candidates that they like. And if you can have a multi-decision environment, which is to say 5 candidates in the general election, and you get to rank your preferences amongst them, you get immediately a very different incentive structure for everyone who's running for office, how they run, how they win, and most importantly, how they govern. And in the current system, if you are seen working across the aisle, that is a threat to your own reelection. In a final five system, if you aren't seen working across the aisle, that's the threat to your own election system. So it comes down to, what do we want as Americans? What are the kind of politics we want? And we have the answer. We have the answer. Political scientists have looked at this. 3 of the top 10 healthiest countries in other parts of the world use different versions of the system I just described. States like Alaska, Maine, municipalities, New York City. So the evidence is accumulating that there's a better way to do politics. We just have to get folks to pay attention. And, open primaries is very much a part of that. And, why veterans? I'll just say, because Americans still trust veterans. And veterans want a role to play. They understand, if you're a patriot in this moment, you understand that we are in a political crisis. It's a political crisis. It's not an American people crisis. It's a political crisis. It's the actors that sort of are called forward to represent the country, but they're operating in an incentive structure that doesn't actually reflect the people of this country. I have no concern about Americans. I have tons of concern about politicians and cable news, but we, the people, can fix that if we can get back to reflecting a country or politics that reflects the country. And veterans I think are the best people to kind of be those agents for change. And so what we see is veterans that understand we have a political crisis. It needs a political solution, but they don't want to be just partisan actors. They don't just want to be snarking on Twitter. That can play a role, but it needs to be more than that. They're understanding what the solutions are. And so that's why, we launched Veterans for Political Innovation. Our strategy is platform veterans, give them a place to show up and exercise their voice. And I'm excited to see a number of our volunteers on the call. So shout out to the folks in Wisconsin and Washington, D.C., New York, and beyond that are part of this as well. So
Terrific. Thank you, Todd, and well said. And I think your words about the incentive structure and the sort of upstream thinking about what it is that produces the results that we end up with is really critical to all of these efforts. And I'll just point out, I know you're active in supporting what's going on in Nevada right now. You are active in supporting what's going on in Alaska. Just to make the point, here in Pennsylvania, maybe you could call it a baby step, but it would be a pretty significant one. We're simply trying to broaden the base of the primary electorate by allowing independents in, which has some of the same, I think, positive effects that more ambitious changes might have. But, as I said earlier, we've got to take ground where we can get it. And even this ground is going to be hard to come by. I want to switch to Dan and Karen. A quick bit of introduction. I actually met Dan in a conversation with another great veteran and someone who stepped up on this issue, Patrick Murphy, who is a colleague of Dan's. Dan was on the introductory call with Patrick and clearly felt strongly about this issue, and then started talking about the experience that he and Karen had when he was in active duty, and how the tangled web of voting rules and regulations as they travel from place to place really confounded things. And I thought that was a really important message to bring forward, is the impact of particularly this regulation, but others as they affect military families. So Dan and Karen, you want to talk about that, maybe replay our conversation or amplify it?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I'm gonna have my wife first introduce herself, kind of where she comes from, what we're doing now with our children, and then I'll take the ball forward and some of the voting stuff. Can you tell us a little about what you're doing?
Sure. So, hello everyone. I'm Karen. I am Dan's wife. We have 3 young children. I'm also a nurse. I have my doctorate in nursing. I'm working at UPenn. But since we were married in 2015, he's been working in the Army, work in his civilian life, and then also in his military life. And we've been in Pennsylvania. We've been out of state in Tennessee. We have friends that live all over the country that are also in the Army. And we've kind of seen firsthand how important it is to be able to have access to be able to be involved in your local, state, and federal politics. And we have found in our travels that it's hard to figure out, I guess, where you are able to vote, how you can vote, what each state is different. And Tennessee has open primaries. We've experienced that, or more, I guess. And then we've come back to Pennsylvania and we're trying to establish ourselves, but have hit some roadblocks, I guess. What else?
It's been challenging. So
it's just challenging, yeah.
Yeah. So David, thanks for having us. And Todd,
Yeah.
It's hard to follow Todd sometimes because he's so eloquent on the matter. But I would say that when if our kids blow in the door, it's just a hazard of doing business at this point in time. But I've had this unique pleasure, this unique opportunity to serve between active duty, guard, and reserves. So we often have these conversations in the framework of what does it look like for active duty people that are coming off of active duty,
Yeah.
or what does it look like as it relates to you leaving the military and then you going back to your state of return and then not being able to vote in those things. Well, I've had the blessing to say that I've spent most of my time in the Guard and Reserves, and I have commanded platoons and companies and organizations anywhere between Philadelphia out to Annville, Pennsylvania, down to Houston, Texas, and out to Dublin, California. And in those opportunities, the people that I get to work with are all great Americans and they're soldiers, and they come to us from different places. But the thing that we all have in common is the ability to have a conversation based on shared values. And those shared values are really based on an embracing of competition, a want to do better, and a want to work for bigger organizations and be part of something that's bigger than ourselves. What then you find when you get back to the state level in Pennsylvania specifically, you don't have the best folks competing. You don't have the reward system that allows the best folks to be part of the system in the first place. And you have a constituency of 800,000 military veterans in the state that aren't allowing people to vote, not only not in their best interests, but against their values. We serve in the military and we spend time with people from Alabama who have very different opinions than the people in Philadelphia. So in certain ways, if you serve in California, you have very different opinions than Houston, but we all share very common things. And I know this conversation is about Pennsylvania, but it's important to know that if you've joined the military, you've seen the world bigger than the state that you came from, and you've got to go back to it and be small again. And it's hard when you're trained as an independent, as you're trained as somebody who wants to think about this, who also likes to compete, to come back to a place where you can't do that anymore. So this unique blend of having the ability to be on active duty, to have done National Guard and reserves all over the country and all over the world, has really been a great foundation for coming back and saying, you know what, we need the ability to change our primary process. We need to open up competition so that the best people can run for office and have a chance to win. And we've got more people able to vote. And if you're limiting people's ability to vote, I've got to be skeptical of you, because you're doing that for an interest outside of the best interest of everybody.
Well said. I particularly like your emphasis on values. That competition is a value I think we all believe in. That's the sort of the underpinnings of this country, and also participation. That's what democracy is about. The more, the merrier. Everybody in the pool. And I also agree with you too. If you, as an elected official, and I know you worked for one earlier in your career, if you're afraid of that, then you don't belong in the business. So,
yeah, you gotta want to get a little dirty. You gotta want to get in the fight. You gotta want to have other people and great ideas and opinions. Yeah. So agreed.
Terrific. Let's turn to Paul in a second.
David, just a quick thing before you talk with Paul. We're going to open it up for questions in a few minutes. And just to let everybody know, the way to ask a question is to go into the chat and type your name and your state and just a 1-sentence description of what question you want to ask. And then either David or I will call on you. So anytime you want to ask a question, just go into the chat and type your name in and we'll get to you.
You took the words right out of my mouth, John.
There you go.
So let's go to Paul. And Paul and I have gotten to know each other last few weeks, months maybe. And I know he's working with John, was good enough to give us a shout out on his podcast about independent Americans. But Paul, just your sort of career journey, what gets you focused and motivated about the interests of independent Americans right now? Why is this such a critical issue to you?
Well, thank you everybody for having me. Happy Friday. David, for me, it's the same reason I joined the military, to protect and defend this country against enemies, foreign and domestic, and to try to do what I can to serve this country that's given so much to me and so many others, and to try to make it better. My grandfather was drafted during World War II. Had spent a couple of years in the South Pacific. My father was drafted out of the Bronx during Vietnam, and I joined, before 9/11 and spent some time overseas and about half a mile from here at Ground Zero in the days after 9/11. So for me, it's always been personal, and it's always been urgent. And I think right now, for me, it's about patriotism. We talk a lot about the Army values, and for those of you that remember them, leadership, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. Those are the values that define the Army, but also this veterans community. And I think, this is a really important time for our country. Elections Day is 2 weeks from now. Veterans Day is 3 weeks from today. And Election Day is a day that will divide everyone. And every year I ran Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, we try to use Veterans Day as a day a couple of days later to bring everyone together. Veterans Day is the one day everybody can unite as Americans, whether you're a veteran or not, around that spirit of service and that respect for patriotism and about respecting those folks who came before us, like Rocky and so many others, and the folks that are going to come in the decades to come. So this Veterans Day, in my view, our democracy is under attack. Our national security is in jeopardy. Our social fabric is being frayed. And veterans are in a unique position to understand, appreciate, and change that. My good friend Dave Chasteen used to say, if America was a religion, veterans would be the clergy. We're the keepers of the faith. We have to remind people in this country, especially in this generation, because so few have served, what this country is all about. And for me, part of that is having a basic voice in your democracy. So the idea that, guys and gals that I served with could go overseas and lose a leg and come home and can't vote in the primary is absurd. It's ridiculous. It's un-American. And I think we're in a unique position to be the forward edge, not just for veterans, but for all Americans. I don't think this is a partisan issue. I keep telling folks, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, open primaries is something you should support because it's good for all of us. But I think like we have so many times in this generation, especially, we've got to be on the forward edge of explaining things to this country and fighting for this country and sacrificing for this country. And Pennsylvania is like the forward edge of the battlefield right now. So, you all are really on that forward edge, and we've got to support you and amplify you. What's happening in Nevada is also important. But, in every battle, you've got a critical forward edge. And right now I see Pennsylvania as that forward edge. And, no better person to have carrying the guidon than Rocky Blyer. So even, I'm ready to follow Rocky anywhere. But I think also his message is resonating. And everything, one thing I learned, David, running IAVA for 14 years, is that almost every issue that was concerning our community, that was important, whether it was burn pits, the GI Bill, unemployment, the PACT Act that passed, this summer, our challenge was just making the country aware of the issue. Once we did that and we said, America, this is what we care about, have our back, the country does. Every single time we make the country aware of our fight, it becomes their fight, and together we can win that fight. And that's my view on this moment in Pennsylvania. And if we, don't win in this battle, we'll keep coming wave after wave until we get to that hilltop. And I think we've got to replicate that across the country. John has been incredible. Todd, so many other folks on this call, I think, have been in that fight without reinforcements for a long time. And I think this is a moment, especially as we come toward Veterans Day, not just Election Day, for the veterans community to be the force multipliers, for us to be the reinforcements, for us to be the ground game and the air game. And also, I ran a nonprofit. We need ammunition. So we've got to fundraise. And for folks who have the capacity to give, they need to do that. And if you have other folks that you got to do that, because, the big party duopoly has got us outgunned. But the Ukrainians were outgunned by the Russians too. And if you're united and you're creative and you're driven, you can win. And I think the Ukrainians have inspired the world in that regard. And I think veterans can do it here. So I'll just end with my thanks for everybody who's been leading on this. I'm excited to be in this fight. I'm recruiting every day, and I think we all should be, is recruiting for this movement, because that's really what it is a movement that's about, saving our democracy, in my view. And the upside is we can bring everybody together and heal in ways that we can't even imagine. So I'm ready to go. I hope our podcast, Independent Americans, is helping. I know the veterans groups are getting more engaged in many ways. And I'll end with this. My grandfather didn't speak English when he came to this country, didn't talk a lot about his time in World War II, but he worked the voting booth every year I can remember before he died. He considered that, a sacred part of the American experience. And the idea that, a guy like my grandfather or any number, I don't know the vets on this call or anywhere else, would be denied from the opportunity to vote because they don't want to pick a party is just bullshit, in my view. I mean, and we got to call it what it is. And I think that young people are behind us, veterans are behind us, so many other people are behind us. Yeah. And it's the good fight. And I'm thankful to be a part of it and happy to be helpful in any way I can.
Great. Well, Paul, you both said this and you communicate this. What we need to create is a sense of urgency. This has got to go from a, gee, that'd be nice to have, that sounds like a good thing to do, to a must have. We have to do this. And, in this business, you have good days and bad days, but I have to say, I had a conversation with a former Republican Pennsylvania governor recently. And I said, that's our challenge, to turn this from a nice to have to a must have. And he said, make no mistake, this is a must have. This is a must have. So when you get folks like that stepping up, gives you a little more, makes you stand up a little taller. We're going to go to questions now. And John, are you been curating and got your eye on?
Yeah, a bunch of questions. Let's start with Al Smith, who has a question about some of the larger veterans organizations. Go ahead, Al, ask your question.
Yeah, as I wrote in the chat, I'm from Connecticut. I'm a Vietnam veteran, member of VFW, member of MOA, that's the Military Officers Association of America. And since I retired 10 years ago, I got I saw the country just going to hell, in my words. And I just didn't like what was happening. So I got involved with organizations such as No Labels, Braver Angels, Fix USA, Fix US, I should say. And I always I thought a group of veterans, veteran movement would be so powerful. I became good friends with my congressional representative, and she said the only pieces of legislation that go through all the time or pass in a bipartisan way are veteran matters. Huh. So veterans have power in Congress. I would think someone should approach the VFWs, the Legions, the MOA, and try to get them on board, or at least get the message out to their members. Now, I know what's going to happen. The first thing the VFWs or MOA is going to say, it's political, and we don't touch anything political. But this is not supporting one party or the other. This is supporting America.
Who wants to take a whack at that? I see Todd come off mute.
Yeah. Well, Al, thanks for your sentiments. I mean, Eric Bronner, my co-founder, really the founder of Veterans for Political Innovation. He met yesterday in DC with leaders of the VFW. I would say this: we all should absolutely be pushing on advocacy organizations. I think what we sometimes refer to as like the legacy Big Four, or maybe it's Big Five, organizations like the VFW, the American Legion. Absolutely, please help us get this prioritized as a legislative priority for them, because I think those organizations are really effective at going to Capitol Hill, getting meetings, and getting this issue expressed. And I think if we can make election innovation, open primaries, ranked choice voting, if we can present these issues as disenfranchising military veterans in particular, that just kind of cuts through the noise. I mean, it's offensive for anyone. Let's be clear. It's offensive for anyone who's a registered independent, or even a registered partisan who might have an independent thought. Say, look, I care about these candidates in this primary, but maybe someone else in a different primary. I mean, that isn't crazy to think that we might form our own independence. Someone said this week to me, independent isn't undecided. Parties try to convince us that independent is, well, you just haven't made up your mind as to whether you like Republican or Democrat. And it's like, in a country full of choices, in a capitalist system, it is just offensive to think that we can only be presented two choices, inferior choices often, and that we're somehow supposed to settle with that. And that's why we have a participation problem. So I agree with you. We need other traditional organizations to come alongside and help us make these reform issues mainstream. And I'd like to see the VFW and other organizations really embrace this as an issue that they can carry water for, because they're very effective at getting to elected officials. IAVA, I would say, has been tip of the spear about helping frame a policy agenda for the post 9/11 generation. and we need to continue to do that. The other thing I would say is, in terms of constituencies, is the business community. I think the business community understands that an unstable political system is very bad for business. And the traditional business roundtables that probably lived with the Republican Party have, in some cases, gone to the Democratic Party, in some cases have stayed out. And I think this is a great way to channel the business community. And David, this is very much, I think, probably centers the work that you're doing in Pennsylvania, where the exhausted business majority who says, look, what we want more than anything is a stable operating environment. So we don't want threats of stolen elections. We don't want threats of, sort of radical outside of the frame kind of attempts on our democracy. We want rational actors operating with a sort of a sensitivity to what the middle moderate majority of Americans want. And so I think the business community, we should be pushing for to play an outsized role on these issues as well. And I think that they're starting to kind of show up and have this opinion as well.
I know that's resonating here in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
my business leader. Paul or Dan?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'm on the board now at Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans American. Jeremy Butler's doing a great job. This is kind of what we had to do at IAVA for 15 years, which is bring an issue that is new to the existing veteran service organizations community and get them on board. We had to get them on board with the GI Bill in the early days. Folks think that was settled, but there is something called the TMC, the Military Coalition, which is 35 of the leading veteran service organizations. And they, I think, should be a focal point of our strategy. And I'm hoping I can help on that because they do tend to move as a group. But we've also got to influence, leadership in these organizations and at the convention. So if you're a member of those organizations and you can make it a part of the agenda in next year's summer convention, you probably got to start now. But I think it'll be, a top level campaign and a grassroots campaign that meets in the middle. And ultimately, these organizations are member driven. And the more they hear from members, the better. But we've also got to educate them. And I think explain to them why this is a new issue that many of them haven't been involved in. And it's not about politics as much as it's about democracy. And that is key here. And it's about citizenship. And I think we've seen the veteran service organizations be more interested in public service and other things like voter registration. So I think we've got to make that case, and you all who are at the local level are well positioned to do that. But it also requires us to have a national strategy for engaging the veteran service organizations. And I'm happy to be a part of helping make that happen.
Great. Dan, did you want to chip in?
Yeah, I would say that it's also, so there's the VSOs, there's other large organizations. But if I went out and sampled the 800,000 veterans that live in the state of Pennsylvania, I wonder how many of them would know why an open primary matters. I wonder how many of their spouses would know why that open primary matters as well, or anybody else that really cares about them. So I think having an understanding of what the problem is and why it matters, and getting to the spouse or the family as well is really, really important. That's why I'm so glad Curran's here. Like when you think about military spouse employment, I sometimes think about this very, very difficult challenge that we're trying to figure out how to do through the world. We know credentials all transfer between states. I don't see how voting is any different besides one other right you're being taken away from by deciding that you want to be involved in. So I think we need to make the story and understanding palatable to the person that may not think about politics the way that we do, at a level that is like, hey man, it really matters. Like it's just one less thing that you're able to do because you've decided to do this. Or to Todd's point, you've decided to be an independent, you've made the decision to be an independent because there's things you care about, and be that way about it. So I think we need to get down to a really low level. We got to get down to the families. We got to make sure that they understand why it matters.
Great. Let's dip back into the questions. John, you got another?
Yeah, we've got a question from Larry Holman in Philly about the legislative strategy in Pennsylvania. Go ahead, Larry.
Yes, this is Larry Holman, Northeast Philadelphia. The question I have about open primaries goes in with the idea of ranked choice voting. And I'm told that neither one of these ideas has a very good chance of getting passed in the legislature. And if you combine them together in the same bill, it almost guarantees failure. Well, I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm just hoping that we can get both of these things done at the same time.
Yeah. Well, good question, and go Birds, right? let me just address that since we're on, hometown turf here. Our conclusion early on was that, as I said, alluded at the outset, that we were going to pursue this independent voter strategy, let's call it, for a couple reasons. One, it's fairly straightforward. The second, and you may know this, but the bill that we're after actually passed the Senate in Harrisburg in the last session with strong Republican support. So that gave us a sense that, we've got folks on the record, we've cut a trail through the forest, which should give us some momentum going forward. It is a legislative strategy. We now had to have bills reintroduced. There's one in the House, one in the Senate. I think I mentioned earlier that we've got a vote coming up in next week in the House, a committee vote. So I think my personal view is I think ranked choice voting is kind of a bridge too far right now in Pennsylvania. We've got to crack this door open and get this done, which I think once people start thinking about, this is sort of to Paul's point, once you build this awareness and bring you folks into the mix and how this impacts veterans and the kinds of values that military service represents, I think it opens up a lot of possibilities. But, back to my football analogy, 3 yards in a cloud of dust. We got to get this one done and then see where that leads us.
David, David, I just want to endorse that thinking, because, I think while we've got, as an organization, like a real aspiration for Final Five voting, I think incrementalism matters, and where you can get wins, you got to get wins. And so, we never go, even if we think it's not the end state, we always come alongside and try to support just folks having the conversation. Do we like our election systems? Are they participatory? Do we get candidates that we're excited about? And one of the things that we know from, open nonpartisan primaries, single ballot primaries, ranked choice voting, is that when voters get a taste of it anywhere on their ballot, they want it everywhere on their ballot. So I have colleagues in Illinois who are working on a state-based strategy just to get municipal elections done with ranked choice voting, on the theory that if people can elect their mayor that way, they're going to realize, hey, this is a simpler, better way to do it. We like our mayor a lot more than we like our, U.S. representatives, because she governs with the majority of us in mind and says and does common sense things. Hey, why can't we get other elections like that? So I think moments and proof points of success are important. One of the things that I'll say about the military community is that there are 5 southern states that do their military overseas ballots using ranked choice voting. And these are 5 southeastern, kind of southern, typically Republican states that do it for their military overseas ballots. A lot of folks don't know that. The reason they do it is because logistically, you don't have to print 2 ballots. It's a simpler way to do it. It ensures that veterans get participation. So folks don't necessarily realize that, or that, this is how the Oscars selects their winners, or that this is how Robert's Rules of Order selects, their folks. That's ranked choice voting. But anywhere we can fight for these wins, I think we've got to. The last thing is, part of what's been powerful about the veteran community is, we're sort of like peanut butter spread out across the country. We're small in terms of numbers, but we live everywhere. And if you catalyze the military community, then you catalyze, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Springfield, Illinois, and, small towns in Oregon and Hawaii and everywhere else. And that's why the, organizations like IAVA and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, they've always been effective because they're nationally branded, but locally activated. And I think this movement's got to be local. And we know that. So,
yeah, good stuff. I see we got 51 questions and 11 minutes. So let's see if we can squeeze a few more in.
Yeah, we're going to Nancy Springer in Virginia, who has a question about conventions. Go ahead, Nancy.
Yes, Virginia is an open primary state. However, last year when we elected the governor, the Republican Party of Virginia hosted a convention in which they they produce their nominee instead of having a primary. So doesn't that kind of system essentially cancel out an open primary state? Just curious
John,
what.
can I throw that to you? John
Sure.
Opdycke?
It does. And it's interesting. One of the things that we work on at Open Primaries a lot is to engage this whole question of who owns the primaries. What are
Yes.
they for? Who created them? Because a lot of right now, the language that comes from the Democratic and Republican Party when they're fighting efforts to open the primaries or create nonpartisan primaries is they say, well, this is the Republican primary. We own this primary, and as such, we determine who can and can't vote in it. That's not the history of primaries. Primaries were not created by the parties. Primaries were created by a populist progressive movement in the country, precisely because the parties and the special interests were locking out the American people from participating fully. So we've been brainwashed over the last 75 years in something that we, the people, created. We now act like it's the parties because that's what they've been saying. So I think situations like Virginia are an opportunity to remind ourselves and our people, why did we create this form of, voting early and then voting in November? We did it because the parties and the special interests were locking us out. And this is just another way they do it, is by saying, well, we're not going to allow you to have your primary. We're going to cancel it, and we're going to have a convention. Why do they get to cancel it? We fund and created that early election. But again, the parties are slick. So I think it really reveals the uphill battle that we're at. And it's part of what I love about the Pennsylvania campaign. The slogan of it, repeal closed primaries. What's built into the name of that is that we enacted it in the first place. You can't repeal something that we didn't enact, and we did it.
True. Yeah.
So I think your question is great, and it really speaks to the convoluted nature that we even understand what primaries are.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pull this back to, I think, what Todd said, or maybe all three of the speakers said, that if you can ground this in fundamental values, right? If you can, as John said, if you can remind people what we're trying to do here, then I think we can, that helps to crack the code. Because otherwise we get somersaulted around with all kinds of, artful interpretations of history. You got another question there, John?
We have one from Guy Lincero in San Francisco about efforts out there. Go ahead, Guy.
Hi, my name is Gay Lazzaro.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm from Northern California. And I was wondering, is there an organization that's already at works to stop closed primaries in the San Francisco Bay Area?
John? Well,
both San Francisco has open primaries and ranked choice voting for municipal elections.
Oh, no, I mean for national, statewide and national voting.
Well, it has an open primary for statewide. It has closed primaries for president. And there is a lawsuit being filed to challenge the fact that all the primaries in California are nonpartisan. There's no more Democratic primary or Republican primary. There's just a nonpartisan primary. And the top two vote getters go to the general election, regardless of party. But not in presidential. In presidential, Democrats can only vote for Democrat, and then independents are at the whims of the parties. But is that not your experience, or what?
No, it's not my experience. I'm very surprised to hear all these things that you're saying. So I registered Democrat so I can at least vote in the Democratic primaries. My husband is independent, and so he cannot vote in Democratic primaries.
Well, I think maybe there's poll workers that are just lying to you, because any voter in California can vote in the primary because there isn't partisan primaries. So make sure your husband goes with you on primary day and says, I want to vote. And they should give him a nonpartisan. I mean, there's just one ballot. There isn't a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot in California.
That's a reminder that any system is only good as its weakest link. And
Yeah.
if any of you have ever, I did my time working the election table over a couple different cycles, and you realize that the fallibility of human beings, even with the best of intentions, that they can't always keep things straight. Let me just slip in a quick commercial. Someone asked about the petition that we're trying to organize in Pennsylvania. Well, it's a digital petition, ballotpa.org/vets. You can also see the veteran leadership that we've assembled, including Rocky Blyer as an honorary co-chair. And I also want to pick up on something that Paul said. Our next sort of focal point is going to be Veterans Day, which is right after our election here. And we're organizing what we hope is some high impact events and opportunities to bring people forward, including our own challenge coin we've just sent to all of the members of the legislature here, that on one side says, let every vet vote in every election. And then on the back, it says, Ballot PA vets, independence is a Pennsylvania value. Again, trying to ground this in value. So with that, maybe there's time for one or two more questions.
I had one more. I had a question, actually, for Paul, Todd, and Dan and Karen. I wanted to ask you about, like, when I think of the military, I think of one of the most racially integrated organizations in the United States. And at a time when politics is, I mirror Todd. I don't worry about the American people. I worry about these ways in which people are pitted against each other and divided. And I was thinking about, did any of you see a relationship between veterans speaking out on these reform issues as connected to, or opportunities to go even broader than that in terms of engaging new ways of dealing with our country's very ugly racial history? Because obviously people in the military have learned something about this, about building with people from different backgrounds. What do you think about that? Am I just putting things together that don't go together, or what do you think?
Yeah, sorry, John. I'm going to jump in there real quick. So there's a couple things that are true about the military generally. It's been an agent for change for its entire existence. So you can go back to the founding of the military and the founding of our country and know that our military has been at the forefront of making sure that things are more equitable and more right. I would also say that when I made the comment around, and I think when we all made the comment around values, the competition is a value of the military, working together is a value of the military, diversity is a value of the military. That is manifested in the way that we all work together. The third part of this is, I agree with Todd's comments around incremental wins and taking incremental wins. But what we're really trying to do, what we really ought to be thinking about, is how do we exponentially change the way that our country interacts with one another and how our political process works. And the only way to do that is by increasing and bringing up the narrative to a higher level about a better world. And so when we're talking about a better world, it's like, hey, we're going to do these things. But what we really care about are fair and equal opportunities, not necessarily outcomes, but opportunities. You want people, I want my kids to live in a better world than the ones that I live in. Like, you want all those great things. And the way to get there is by having continuity of leadership and continuity of messaging at a very high level. So the values that are instilled in me and the values that are instilled in us by serving and being part of it need to be elevated and exponentially delivered. I think that's what we're really looking for. Incremental wins to get there, exponential change. But the only way you get to exponential change is by having some incremental wins over time.
That's great.
Well said.
Todd, sorry for stealing your thunder, man, but that was like such a really great quote. And I wanted to play off that a little bit.
I loved it. Paul, why don't you give your thoughts and then I can.
I mean, I think there's when we talk about issues that the American public doesn't understand, this is maybe the greatest opportunity to solve a huge voter disenfranchisement issue than anything else in America. And so, if you assume that we can get, tens of millions of veterans in the process that aren't right now, I think that baked into that is a high level of diversity, a high level of patriotism, a high level of civic engagement, The fastest growing percentage of women, of veterans, are women. So I think part of this is about educating the country about what the new military looks like. And it's not like the 3 white guys and 1 white woman here who are talking. I mean, it's much more diverse than that. So I think this is an opportunity for us to show the new face of the military, which is also the new face of America. And I think the new face of political engagement. And it's much more diverse. And I think it's much more unified. You know, I think that the military can be an example for unity and cohesion and tolerance and common cause. So, you know, almost every problem out there in America is kind of thrown at veterans to solve, which is maybe our toughest mission of all, but we're always up for it. And it comes back to one thing for me. I'm always inspired by the folks on this call, the folks that I meet out in the community. And for every bad story about somebody, you know, kicking in a door in the Capitol, there are 10 of them out there working to get people registered to vote. So maybe I'll end with one thing. You know, there's a Firewatch Roadshow going on of veterans and Afghan allies that have been going all around America to try to support our Afghan allies and pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. And I keep saying it's like the opposite of January 6th. I mean, they're so respectful and thoughtful and strategic and unified, and they're making real change. And it's good trouble and good change. And I think that is something I want to elevate and celebrate. And I think the open primaries fight and what's happening in Pennsylvania is a good story about the potential of America that's being led by veterans that can be an example for everybody.
Terrific. Todd, do you have a brief final word on that or other thoughts?
I would just say that movements like the one that we're attempting have to succeed as a multiracial coalition. And that's just, we have to center that this is about more folks representing their values in our political system. And folks have been fundamentally disenfranchised, and that cuts across communities, that cuts across identity, even though the two-party system will tell us a narrative that's different from that. We know in the work that we're doing that ranked choice voting in New York City in their last mayoral elected their first African-American mayor in over 30 years, the most diverse city council that they've ever had, the most female representation on their city council. So data is clear that when you implement ranked choice voting, it increases diversity, gender, race, but also ideological diversity. And so that's the outcome of this work. But we do it because we believe, even though I have strong, partisan views in certain races and I participate in partisan ways, we believe that this country only works when everyone has a seat at the table, and our current system doesn't allow for that. And so we have to embrace the ability to create more participation. And that's how we continue to never fulfill, but always move closer to the aspiration of what America can be.
Excellent. Well, Paul and Karen and Dan and Todd, thanks for the inspiration and the affirmation and the willingness to work together on all this. And John, thanks to you and your team for willingly and on fairly short notice hosting this conversation. And we all got a lot of work to do. So, John, anything you want the last?
Yeah, thank you all. We're a few minutes over, so we'll wrap it up here. We're having our next virtual discussion on November 1st with Tom Riley and Jackie Salett, who have just launched the Center for Independent and Sustainable Democracy at Arizona State University, and really eager to talk with them about the independent voter. So you'll get an email about that. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email so you can share the Rocky Bleier video with your friends and networks. And also this hearing that David mentioned next week in Pennsylvania. The Ballot PA is putting a lot of energy into mobilizing voters in Pennsylvania to contact their elected officials to get them to support this. So anything you can do to talk to your friends and family in Pennsylvania, those emails can make a difference. So you'll be getting a follow-up email in the next 48 hours with that information. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David. Thanks, panelists.
Thank you, John. Thank you all.
Thank you, John. Thank you, David, for your leadership.